Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our event. I'm Jolene Sanjak. I'm the team leader for a UK-funded program called the Land Facility. The Land Facility partners with governments around the world to strengthen land governance so that tenure rights for communities, small farmers may be secured, so that investments in land are transparent and inclusive, and so that land becomes much more sustainably managed. We're here today with this event partnering with our colleagues in the Global Action for Land Initiative. And the theme that we're here to talk about is the importance of incorporating this topic of improving land governance and securing land rights into the formal UNFCCC outcome documents maybe in a couple of years from now. So we're trying to create momentum towards that. So I'll hand over to my colleague Washe to lead the session. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Jolene, for the introduction and for the overview. I think before we start, I'll just give an overview of what Global Action for Land, or GAL, is. GAL is a movement that was started in 2022, and it's a group of land sector actors and also some government representatives who are working to ensure that land governance is well incorporated in the global policy discussions. And I already have to thank the government of Brazil because they are one of the examples of governments who are integrating responsible land governance into their climate and environmental interventions. So before we start with our panel discussion, I'd like to make some remarks to set the scene on why we as GAL think land governance is something that should be integrated more into this climate convention. So for many developing countries, most accessible and affordable pathways to address climate change are often land-based. This is the case for both mitigation and adaptation. And on the mitigation side, we have things like forestation, afforestation to absorb carbon, agroforestry, and improved livestock to cut emissions and efforts to halt deforestation. All these efforts are efforts that are land-based, and even when you consider things such as renewable energy, such as solar and wind, all these interventions require land and therefore require responsible land governance. On the adaptation side, we also have interventions like climate-smart agriculture, sustainable land management, and ecosystem restoration, which all require better land governance for us to make progress on our national interventions. However, while Brazil and some other countries are the exceptions, often when we have weak land governance in other countries, we are already limiting the extent to which we can achieve our climate and environmental objectives. So, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has also released a report, which was a special report on climate change and land, which shows the link between land governance and climate action. And this report encourages countries to develop land policies that will connect the two topics at the national level so that they can use resources better and enhance environmental action while ensuring that environmental action is sustainable, it's equitable, and it is just. So this is kind of the general overview of the remarks I wanted to use to introduce us to this topic and start linking the two topics of land governance and climate action. To us, the message is clear. Aligning land and climate policies is not only just a desirable outcome, it's essential. Responsible and inclusive land governance can optimize resource use, strengthen social resilience, and support ecosystem restoration. And to go further into this topic, we have a panel of experts and also government experts who can give us their perspectives on how these two topics of land and climate policies can come together and work together to be able to ensure that both interventions are moving us towards sustainable environmental and land use. And with that, I'd like to now first pose my questions to the panel. And I'll start with Alan, who's the Program Director of Rights, Climate and Conservation at the Rights and Resources Initiative. And one moment, sorry.
Can you hear me? Sorry to interrupt, but I just want to make sure that everybody has seen the QR code in case you need simultaneous interpretation. If you can scan that and you can hear in your own language. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Jolene. And apologies also, by the way. Maybe I should give all a moment to scan the QR code. It's okay? Continue? Okay. Okay, thank you. And I'll start with Alan. Yeah, I was making the introduction. Alan is a PhD, is program director at the Program Director for Rights, Climate and Conservation at the Rights and Resources Initiative. With over 3 decades of experience in areas related to natural resource management, biodiversity conservation, and climate change, Alan began his career with national forests and protected area agencies in North America before transitioning into international development, where he has provided technical assistance and monitoring and evaluation expertise to multilateral and bilateral agencies. And I want to go further into the introduction. I think it's a longer paragraph, but Alan, RRI has done a lot of work on tracking global recognition of indigenous and Afro-descendant and community land rights. From your perspective, how critical is the recognition and documentation of IPLC land and forest tenure rights in strengthening climate mitigation? And as a follow-up to that question, could you share, based on RRI's work, your perspectives on the importance of incorporating land governance considerations to ensure NDC targets are achieved? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, it's working. Thank you very much, Washe. Yes, I'd like to begin by first perhaps making the case for why land is so important in the context of NDCs. I don't think we fully grasp the implications of this. There is a group of researchers, of which I'm a part of, called the Land Gap Report. The latest report was put out on Wednesday, and it shows basically it reviewed 168 NDC submissions covering 194 countries. And globally, all of these countries are committing to requiring over a billion hectare of land to meet carbon dioxide removals by 2050. This is an area greater than the size of the United States. So there's a huge implication in terms of land, and nearly half of this will require some form of land use change, so either afforestation or reforestation. And likewise, we're seeing across those NDCs a limited ambition to actually halt deforestation and degradation, with only 18 countries out of these mentioning efforts to do so. So that's a critical gap. And we need to link this to other land use demands, whether it's maintaining ecosystem services such as freshwater management, supporting the food needs of the growing global population. There's the corporate net zero commitments around the use of voluntary carbon markets in Article 6.4. All of these will create huge demand on lands and territories, and we must not forget the Global Biodiversity Framework, which calls for doubling the total area under conservation management by 2030. So the UNFCCC synthesis report that came out a few weeks ago, and our analyses show that there's actually growing recognition of indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant peoples, and local communities across these NDCs. So everybody mentions them, that they're important. However, there are persistent deficits in terms of legal measures, targets, resources to translate these values into effective rights recognition. The 2025 Land Gap Report also notes that only 10 countries reference the need to strengthen tenure security with clear goals in their NDCs. So out of 194 countries, only 10 mention that it's important that we should do something. And only 8 countries explicitly refer to a free, prior, and informed consent, and none actually mention mechanisms to redress their rights in case of rights violation. When we look at who owns the world's lands, the latest analysis show that globally, communities have ownership rights over 11% of the global land surface. However, when we dig down and look at lower and middle income countries, that percentage drops to only 9%, covering 54 countries. And we know through our research that communities have legal customary rights to over at least half of the global landmass. So that's a critical gap in terms of meeting the potential of what we're talking about. The last research we did showed that between 2015 and 2020, there were over 100 million hectares recognized for indigenous people, local communities, and Afro-descendant peoples. However, the potential, meaning if we actually applied existing laws and regulations in just 18 of the countries that we looked at, we would actually increase that total area recognized by at least 250 million hectares. And the potential is even much greater when we look at across the 48 countries where we have available data. It shows that we can actually recognize at least 1.3 billion hectares of land for communities if we actually went through reforms and implemented the recognition of their rights. So why are rights important in NDCs? Strong territorial rights to the 3 Rio Conventions. They're associated with lower rates of deforestation and degradation across all land biomes. This includes dry lands. They are linked to better biodiversity conservation, and they provide more equitable and sustainable benefits for people than any other land management regime. Rights-based actions are in fact the only proven pathway of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And we know that tenure insecurity leads to permanent land use and unsustainable land use forms, whether this is the expansion of agricultural production, resource extraction, forest fires even, and they're linked to greater emissions, biodiversity loss, and they undermine the Earth's system boundaries. And they're also, of course, linked to conflict, inequality, poverty, and increasingly they undermine democracy worldwide. There were critical breakthroughs that were made. As some of you know, countries committed through the Intergovernmental Land Tenure Commitment to securing rights to at least 160 million hectares by 2030, and they renewed their financial pledge to achieve such ends, providing at least $1.8 billion to serve such purposes. But much more will be needed if we want to get there. An integrated land governance system for the UNFCCC means actually reviewing the economic structures that limit countries' abilities to pursue deforestation-free development pathways. It means addressing sovereign debt, which actually creates commodity dependence amongst most countries, reform the international financial transparency and tax cooperation rules, reform trade and investments rules that undermine all of progress towards more sustainable land use forms. All of these things actually undermine indigenous peoples, local communities, Afro-descendant peoples' rights, and this is why we need to better embed this land governance topic in all Rio conventions, not just the UNFCCC. So with that, I'll pass it.
Thank you, Alan, for the remarks, and also thank you for trying to connect the different considerations we should be making here. I think at the beginning you mentioned the reference to the 1 billion hectares, which is a huge amount of land that is expected to deliver climate and environmental objectives. And you also mentioned that strong territorial rights equals low deforestation and less degradation, which takes us to other environmental conventions, so they need to strengthen it in this convention. And with that, I'd like to move now to our next panelist, Beth. Beth is the director for the Center for Women's Land Rights at Landesa, and she also leads Landesa's Stand for Her Land campaign. So, Beth, my first question to you is, how can securing women's land rights and enhancing their leadership in land governance further strengthen the impact and fairness of these land-based climate actions? And as a follow-up to that question, from Landesa's work on responsible investments in property and land, what policies or good practices in land governance can ensure that land-based climate investments will truly support mitigation and adaptation at the national level?
Thank you so much, Washa. Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? And is the translation working all right? Okay. Please flag if you can't hear. I know it's loud in here. It's so nice to be here with you all. I'm going to speak just a little bit to the problem of women's land rights as well as progress on women's land rights, just from a land advocate perspective. I know there are many of us here who are advocating for stronger tenure rights, and then I'll speak to that link that Washa pointed to between women's land rights and successful action across the Rio Conventions, which Alan has set up very nicely for me. So I think you've all gotten a sense of the scale and scope of the challenge of securing land tenure rights. This issue affects massive quantities of land across the world, implicates quantities of land across the world, and also implicates, as Alon was saying, billions of people around the world. It's estimated that there are 2.5 billion people living in rural or in indigenous communities worldwide. And as Alon said, we see legally recognized rights to only about 11% of that land for those people. So we're talking about a third of humanity. So, and then we're not even touching the link between urban and rural spaces, and of course the tenure issues that are associated with housing and food security all along that spectrum. Women, of course, make up half the population of those living in indigenous and rural communities. And despite enormous progress over the last several decades in securing guarantees at the international levels to women's rights as human rights, at the regional levels, particularly in the African Union, and at the national levels, we see constitutional guarantees for property rights. We see legislative guarantees for equitable rights for women to land and territory and natural resources, inheritance and property. And yet we see an incredible gap that remains. Still in almost 40 countries, women do not have equal rights to own marital property and don't have automatic rights to inherit their land if their spouse dies. Girls are disadvantaged in terms of inheritance in almost 40 countries as well. And we see that beyond the places where we still need to close that gap for strong land governance standards for women, we also see in many, many countries, also almost 100 countries around the world, where customary and religious norms prevent women from accessing, protecting their rights to land, particularly rights to ownership, in the case even when they do have equitable legal rights that are established. So we have a significant gap between what is happening for women in practice, and this varies greatly across region and across context, but at the global level, what we can say in the aggregate, pulling up to where we are here, is that there is an attitude that land is not for women, and that manifests in different ways and in different contexts, but that women experience gender-based violence when they try to claim their rights. They experience a lot of social pressure not to claim their rights. And so there is a huge need to strengthen laws and also to go into communities to ensure that women and men understand their rights to land and to ensure that women are able to equitably claim those rights. And of course, we talk about women's land rights as a very quick shorthand for in-depth gender analysis. And this is my plea, my reminder, my urging and encouraging to everyone in the audience around what it takes to have gender equitable results in the context of securing land tenure. Women, of course, do not exist in a vacuum. They exist in families, they exist in communities, we exist in complex social and economic relationships within our homes and communities and societies. So when we're talking about securing tenure, Landesa advocates for starting with women. We've seen over decades of work on land reform that if you take a gender-blind approach, or if you assume that women will benefit equitably, or even if you're just trying to benefit women or include women in land tenure interventions, often what you end up with at the end is women's rights weakened or extinguished rather than equitably strengthened alongside men. But if you start with women and you recognize that web of relationships and you strengthen rights for everyone within the community using a gender analysis, what you end up with is the ability to address those social norms that often prevent women from recognizing their rights, and you end up taking the heat out of the gender conversation. You end up speaking directly to men, helping them to understand with often their primary status as breadwinners, providers for the family, what is the benefit of including their wife, their daughter in their will or in their inheritance? What is the benefit of equitably deciding on which crops to grow? So just an encouragement to close that gap, and some good news at that front. Washa mentioned that I'm the global lead for a global advocacy initiative called Stand for Our Land. This is in partnership with RRI as part of our steering committee, many other global partners in this space, and we're working in 11 countries and currently changing our model to expand to 30 more countries to include partners that have been asking to join. And this initiative is focused on closing that gap that I just described. So that gap between the international standard for women's rights that says women's rights to land and natural resources are fundamental human rights, and what we see in practice, which is that discrimination often prevents women from claiming those rights. So I'm going to move on to this connection between women's land rights and climate change. Again, there's this sort of divide between, so I just talked about the sort of legal guarantees for women's land rights and then what we see in practice. There's a similar sort of way of describing how women's land rights contributes to climate change and how women's land rights are impacted by climate change. So women, I'm sure many of you have heard someone say at COP so far that women are disproportionately impacted by climate change. This is a familiar set of talking points for many of us. Women are less likely to be able to adapt to climate change. Women are less likely to have mobility. Again, women are likely to experience increased rates of gender-based violence in the context of climate impacts. Conversely, what we see, and Landesa actually just developed an evidence scan on the connection between women's secure rights to land and outcomes related to adaptation and mitigation. So we see three pathways, ways in which the existing literature, in which there is a huge gap, and we need to do a lot more research on land tenure broadly, as Alan was talking about, but also specifically on data related to women's land rights. But in the existing literature, what we see is that women's land tenure security contributes to increased sustainability of forest management. So when women are included on management committees, when women are able to voice their interests in the context of how agroforestry is done, how fisheries are cultivated in the context of mangroves, that you see better sustainability, better management, better longevity for the ability of communities to manage forests. The second pathway is through long-term investments in land. So one of the things that Washa was saying in his introduction is that in terms of the relationship between land tenure security and climate action outcomes, and again, across the Rio Conventions, at the local level, there's no separation between climate action, biodiversity conservation, and land restoration. It's the same land. It's an integrated experience for people living on this land. So we see that the investments in agroforestry, the investments in being able to prevent flooding, being able to cultivate soil restoration, these investments are strengthened when women have stronger rights to land specifically. And this is often linked to women's primary role as food producers, their primary gendered role as cultivators for household consumption. So when this is the case, you also see co-benefits in terms of food security, in terms of nutrition, and then in terms of income for the family that's then able to be used for children's education, for healthcare, for all kinds of things that we want to see from a development perspective. The third pathway is greater ability to adopt response measures. So in the context of adaptation, when communities are struggling with decreased soil health, with the need to be mobile, when women have stronger, more recognized tenure rights within their communities, they are better able to take on new technologies or be better able to find alternative livelihoods than they would be if they had otherwise weaker tenure. So I've gotten excited and I've talked for too long, so I'm going to leave it there for now. Thank you, Washa. Thanks, everyone.
No worries at all, Beth. Thank you for the detailed overview of how also the women's land rights topic connects to this. And I think this is kind of leading us to see why we are pushing for the integration of land governance as a whole, because there are so many different aspects of land governance that fit into this convention. So we are seeing a lot of attention to IPLC rights, which is a very good thing, positive direction. But then there are other sub-aspects of land governance, such as women's land rights, that also equally need to be highlighted within the convention. Yeah. And okay, so thank you for the feedback again, Beth, and for the input from the perspective. So far we've heard from RRI and from Landesa, and these are both non-government inputs. But now I'd like us to move to Bruno Kono, who's the president of the State Land Institute of Para here in Brazil. And to you, Bruno, I'd like to ask, first I'd like to maybe congratulate Brazil for the leadership in this sector, for doing so much, because I think Brazil is part of they were leading the Tropical Forest Forever facility, and Brazil is also part of the Intergovernmental Land Tenure Commitment, and Brazil is also part of the land facility. So we can see the push from the Brazilian government and the political will to prioritize land governance within environmental and climate intervention. So this is a positive. But then I'm not sure how it feels to be the government that's leading this cause. So my question to you is, what has been the experience so far in recognizing and documenting land and forest rights of indigenous peoples and local communities? and in reforming land governance systems to strengthen climate action. So what are the things that the audience can learn about how to go about this in other countries?
Thank you and good morning. First, thank you, Land Facilities, for this opportunity to show our work at the state of Pará. Thank you very much, Jolene. Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity for Amazon. And welcome, Wash. Welcome to Belém, Wash. Welcome to Belém, Beth. Welcome to Belém, Alan. Bem, eu gosto de fazer toda a palestra em inglês, né? Só que eu não vou gastar todo o meu inglês aqui com vocês. Bem, essa pergunta, eu acho que você fez, ela é de extrema importância, que a gente acaba demonstrando qual é a importância do processo da regularização de terras, não só no Brasil, mas o Brasil impulsionando essa necessidade, essa situação. Porque todo mundo acha que só tem problema fundiário, de falta de regularização fundiária no Brasil, mas não. O Alan trouxe aqui um cenário sobre direitos consuetudinários, direitos de posse consuetudinárias, por conta de falta de regularização em outros países. Da mesma forma, a Beth trouxe também o cenário da necessidade que essas políticas públicas de regularização fundiária cheguem também às mulheres por conta da necessidade de uma proteção territorial. No fim das contas, tudo é proteção territorial. Então, eu vou contar a experiência aqui do estado do Pará, rapidamente, e mostrar que nós conseguimos desenvolver várias soluções, como políticas públicas, para a gente alcançar essa proteção territorial, seja para comunidades quilombolas, indígenas, seja para mulheres também, políticas direcionadas para garantir inicialmente a proteção territorial e dali, Wash, sair as demais políticas da agenda climática, da agenda social, da melhoria de qualidade de vida dessas pessoas. Bem, só que essa experiência aqui, tudo que eu falar aqui, ela se aplica ao território nacional, porque as pessoas se enganam muito achando que o que eu falo só se aplica à Amazônia. Ao contrário, isso aqui é uma regra nacional, um regime jurídico nacional, que a gente vai demonstrar que é possível, sim, apesar das necessárias fases de um processo de regularização fundiária, a gente poder atender com eficiência essas pessoas. Né? Passou? Não está passando? Não deu. Acabou o crédito do... Acabou o crédito. Pode. Bem, daí eu queria mostrar para vocês, apresentar para vocês, o ITERPA é um Instituto de Terras do Pará, responsável pelas regularizações das terras que são de propriedade do Estado. E o ITERPA, ele foi criado em 78. Esse era o modelo de regularização do ITERPA desde 1978, ou seja, com caneta, com papel, uma caneta, ou seja, sem nenhuma modernidade, obviamente, só que isso se perpetuou no tempo. Ou seja, até 2021, no Brasil, se fazia a regularização fundiária da forma mais arcaica. Não, eu acho que eu peguei aqui de forma mais arcaica, demorada. Daí toda essa preocupação de não conseguirmos encontrar a fórmula para a gente garantir direitos territoriais definitivos para essas pessoas. E aí o Estado estabeleceu 12 eixos estratégicos para modernizar a política fundiária do Estado. Então aqui uns 12 modelos. Né? Fala-se muito na decisão política, e é a decisão política do Estado de querer garantir esses direitos territoriais, e a gente começa esse processo de modernização do serviço de regularização fundiária no Brasil. E uma das coisas que nós investimos e percebemos, nossa, para tudo tem tecnologia. Porque para a regularização fundiária, Wash, não tem tecnologia. Por que a gente não pode usar tecnologia a partir do nosso conhecimento e investir em regularização fundiária, uma regularização fundiária mais moderna, mais eficiente? E aí a gente desenvolveu o CICARF. O CICARF é justamente essa plataforma tecnológica que nos permite fazer um processo de regularização fundiária, seja de uma comunidade da floresta, seja agricultores familiares, sejam grandes produtores rurais, né, sejam regularizações fundiárias urbanas, de núcleos urbanos. A gente tem condições de fazer todo esse trabalho de ponta a ponta, todo esse trabalho dentro de um único sistema que dialoga com outros sistemas também. E aí a gente consegue pegar todas as fases da regularização fundiária, né, a vistoria da área, a demarcação dos pontos, onde começa, onde termina a propriedade, seja ela rural, seja ela uma área urbana, seja uma de ocupação irregular dentro de uma periferia, e fazemos tudo em análise automatizada. Conseguimos juntar todas essas pontas dentro do sistema, tudo que seria necessário para a gente. Tá? E diante da tramitação de todo o processo, que passa por várias fases, nós conseguimos entregar um título de terras, o documento desses homens e mulheres do campo, através de segurança jurídica, com documentos que nos permitam fazer a verificação se é um documento válido, onde é que está essa área dessa pessoa, para justamente ajudar a reconhecer esse direito. E fora isso, nós temos todo um banco de dados integrado ao governo federal. Então nós já utilizamos também o sistema do GovBR, já utilizamos conexões para que não sair só apenas o título de terras, mas sair todos os outros documentos necessários, como o CCIR, o CIGEF, que é cobrado pela nossa legislação. A gente está trabalhando fortemente agora com os cartórios para que a gente possa levar ao registro no cartório desses documentos também, em parceria com o CNJ, o Conselho Nacional de Justiça, e a integração com plataformas nacionais, como Terras do Brasil, o mapa da ONF, né, e o Sistema Nacional de Regularização Fundiária, que o Estado do Pará é um dos estados que financiou isso, para a gente ter uma base nacional única de regularização fundiária. Tá? Então, o CICARF ele não é apenas um software, ele é mais do que isso. Né? É um modelo de governança fundiária necessário para tornar mais eficiente a entrega desse serviço público de proteção territorial, seja para aqueles que nos demandarem esses pedidos. E quais são os nossos resultados? Bem, nesse período de 2019 até 2025, nós já conseguimos documentar 43.444 áreas. Dessas áreas, 80% são áreas da agricultura familiar, territórios quilombolas e comunidades extrativistas. 80%. Desses 80%, 70% tem como liderança, como chefe de casa, as mulheres, Beth. As mulheres estão aqui nesse processo com tamanha representatividade. Pessoas beneficiadas diretamente. A gente estima que a gente passou das 200 mil pessoas beneficiadas, porque cada família, quando você entrega um documento desse, da terra, você não está beneficiando só aquela pessoa que está com o nome no título. Você está beneficiando e protegendo uma família ali. E aí, olha esse dado interessante. Nesse período, nós já conseguimos regularizar para a agricultura familiar, territórios quilombolas e comunidades tradicionais na Amazônia, mais de 1 milhão de hectares. Então, quando as pessoas falam assim, não tem regularização fundiária na Amazônia, nós temos dados, nós temos documentos que comprovam isso. E aí a nossa grande missão é como é que eu conecto agora essa política pública, esses resultados, à agenda climática, às agendas sociais de acesso a crédito, de acesso à moradia, porque documento tem. E qual era a grande objeção que era colocado antes para a gente? Ah, eu não posso levar essa política pública, essa comunidade não pode receber um projeto de bioeconomia porque não tem regularização fundiária. Então não tem mais essa desculpa. Para esse território da agricultura familiar, territórios quilombolas, comunidades tradicionais, o governo do estado já ultrapassou 1 milhão de hectares regularizados. Ou seja, criamos um ambiente jurídico para que esses grandes projetos da agenda climática pousem nesse trabalho. Fora isso, e aí também adicionando aqui do OSHAS, quando a gente tem a regularização fundiária, a gente cria o vínculo daquela pessoa, o vínculo jurídico daquela pessoa com a terra. E isso faz com que a gente possa combater melhor o desmatamento, cobrar a regularização ambiental dessa pessoa, porque ela passa a ser proprietária daquela área, independente se for uma comunidade, independente se for uma pessoa física. Então, o Estado tem condições também, não só de cobrar, mas de auxiliar esse processo de regularização das outras variáveis dessa área, como esse nosso trabalho ele foi reconhecido pelo governo federal, foi testado e aprovado pelo governo federal, que recebeu gratuitamente a ferramenta para ser distribuído para todos os estados do Brasil. E hoje nós já estamos no trabalho, a gente trabalha nesse modelo de gestão no Pará, Maranhão, Amapá, Roraima e Bahia. Também estamos entrando no estado do Piauí, estado de São Paulo e estado de Santa Catarina. Ou seja, é um processo de gestão, não é só uma tecnologia. A gente está levando um modelo de gestão que permita com que haja eficiência nesse trabalho de regularização. Porque todo mundo fala, demora muito, isso é muito difícil, não vai dar para fazer. E a gente está provando que a gente tem condições de fazer sim, né? Inclusive, a gente recebeu um prêmio, 3 prêmios do Conselho Nacional de Justiça, reconhecendo o nosso trabalho, reconhecendo a nossa tecnologia, reconhecendo o nosso modelo de gestão para a regularização fundiária. Aqui eu deixei as nossas publicações para que vocês possam conhecer melhor o nosso trabalho de regularização fundiária, esse novo modelo que a gente vem apresentando, esse modelo que é super importante para colaborar com a agenda climática, porque é através da regularização fundiária que vai ser possível pousar, atrair investimentos com segurança jurídica. O investidor, o doador, vai ter certeza de que ele está fazendo a aplicação dele, aquele investimento, num local seguro, num local que tenha toda a estrutura para desenvolver esses projetos. Queria deixar essa frase para terminar para vocês. Não se promove o ordenamento territorial e a regularização fundiária na sociedade do século XXI e a sua agenda climática sem o investimento e com a mesma infraestrutura, mentalidade e soluções da década de 70 do século passado. Muito obrigado pela oportunidade. Jolene, thank you very much. Land Facility, thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno, for the detailed overview of the difficult journey of trying to regularize land reforms to improve the systems. And I'm happy that you've given the detailed overview, including the investment in both legal reform, but also technological reform to ensure that things progress faster. And you also mentioned, I think you mentioned something about the ensuring that this, from smallholder farmers to community level landowners have documented ownership, and this, as research has shown, is important for them to incentivize them to implement sustainable land management practices. So even on one hand, we have forestry and forestation at scale, but also for the smallholder farmer to ensure they are using their land in the best way and ensuring that we are addressing the land degradation problem over a longer period. And I think you also mentioned the issue of women being sufficiently involved in this land regularization process. And I'm sure, Beth, you're happy to hear that part about women involvement in this. Yeah. So at this point, with the feedback we've gotten, I want to ask if there's any question from the audience that they would like to ask from what we've had so far. Oh.
Thank you very much for this very interesting panel. I'm a researcher and I work on this issue of digital transformation and land governance, and I thought it was really great to see the experience. It's really great to see the experience of the state of Pará, and it's very inspiring, but I wanted to have the perspective of the other panelists on how important is this modernization and this transformation of the digital infrastructures of the administration to achieve women's rights or for climate justice. Thank you.
Okay, I think both of you, maybe Alan can start, then Beth.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that question. Actually, technology is key to the future, as we all know. And what's really interesting now is that we have phone apps, we have applications that can be used at the territorial level, that can be used to map jurisdictions, and not jurisdictions, but community land areas, and exactly do what Pará is doing. And that's being applied now in across regions. We need more of this. We need more accessibility. Many of the communities live in areas that do not have connectivity to local systems, grid systems, but there are satellite systems, and those cost a little bit more money. And so we need to provide the financial resources to make that happen. But clearly, there are great opportunities right now to leverage those to advance this agenda forward. But the issue is not so much demarcating and the land areas. It's getting them through the registration process legally that is a bit more challenging. So communities are mapping, they're engaging, they're doing that everywhere. It's transforming those maps into legal instruments that get recognized by states. That's the process that takes a bit longer, and there are no technologies for solving that problem.
Thank you, Alan. And Beth, if you could add anything.
Just nodding along with. Oh, is it working? Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for the question. I think I'm just nodding along with Alan here that technology is very key, essential for equity, essential for making this type of, for making land administration efficient and effective and accessible and universal. With gender, the question is always, how are the social barriers being addressed in this process that Alan is describing of, how is land registered? How is that recognized? Are we accounting in the context of technology for who has a smartphone at the local level? If lands do need to be demarcated, are surveyors trained to talk to women? Or are they just talking to the male leaders of the community? Do women understand the processes to the same degree as men do? When a woman goes to the administration office, is she asked where her husband or her brother is before she's allowed to go through the process? Are there social barriers even to her accessing the conversation, let alone the process and her level of information? So again, I think what I'm pointing to and what I didn't maybe say as clearly as I would have wanted to earlier is in land interventions, unless you are budgeting for that type of analysis around gender, you will end up with inequitable outcomes for women and girls. So it's really, really crucial. These programs are essential. The work is really, really admirable. And in terms of gender equity, that there needs to be the type of integration that we're hearing from our colleague here.
Thank you, Beth, for the input. I believe there's another question from the audience, and maybe we can take 2 or 3 questions in this round, then we can answer to all of them. Okay.
Ok.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Bem, bom dia, meu nome é Venceslau Braz, eu sou do estado de Roraima, presidente da Cooperativa de Carbono da Amazônia. Eu primeiro quero parabenizar pelo brilhante painel, muito interessante. Que o maior problema da Amazônia hoje, principalmente no mercado de carbono, é a definição fundiária, a grilagem, a sulapiagem das terras na Amazônia. O estado de Roraima, e agora parabenizo o estado do Pará, pelo fato de estar mostrando aí a legalização dessas propriedades, dessas terras. que para mim não é tudo para o pequeno produtor rural. O produtor rural, quando ele pega o seu documento, ele vai na agência bancária, o banco nem olha para ele se ele não tiver garantia. Então, é importante o documento? É. Mas eu até quero perguntar ao senhor se há alguma proposta do governo do estado aqui de financiar ou de fazer algum empréstimo para essas pessoas que vão receber esse documento, porque ter documento não é tudo. Ele vai querer o documento para vender, para comprar, para plantar açaí, para plantar macaxeira, para dar o seu sustento. E o banco não olha para isso. Então, há alguma proposta do governo do estado do Pará nesse sentido de valorizar esse documento, que é um trabalho árduo. Legalizar essas terras dentro da Amazônia não é fácil. Mas é importante que tenha, ao final, um fundo de aval para esse produtor rural. Existe aqui no estado do Pará?
Excelente pergunta, porque o documento da terra não pode ser o fim em si mesmo. E antes de te responder, eu queria só complementar a resposta, respondendo aqui, depois de todos os painelistas colocarem todos os seus pontos de vista essenciais e fundamentais, está tudo nesse mesmo contexto, mas quando eu fiz a apresentação, foi rápido, mas são 12 eixos de atuação. A gente não vê apenas sobre lei de forma cartesiana, o que é lei, o que é tecnologia, são vários elementos que nós relacionamos, para justamente entender como a gente consegue entregar esses resultados, que é regularizar as terras. Então, você tem decisão política envolvida, atualização legislativa, né? Então, são esse conjunto de fatores que faz com que o sistema seja uma parte apenas dele, que é fundamental, que é o aspecto tecnológico. Sem esses outros fatores, não vai funcionar tecnologia no mundo nenhum. Se a gente não organizar essas informações, dialogar, não vai funcionar. Porque às vezes me perguntam, Bruno, então o que salvou o estado do Pará foi o CICARF. Não, foi todas essas ações coordenadas para chegar nesse momento. Ou seja, nós organizamos primeiro a nossa cozinha para poder termos os resultados. Um outro ponto que é importante que o senhor colocou, que aí eu vou para a resposta, a gente nunca entendeu, nunca passou na nossa compreensão que teria que desvincular a regularização fundiária das outras agendas. Ao contrário, quando a gente faz o CICARF faz análise ambiental de acordo com o Código Florestal, ele faz análise do cenário de desmatamento para encaminhar aquela pessoa para regularização ambiental. O que é que nós queremos? Ninguém quer afastar ninguém das políticas públicas. Nós queremos incluí-las e dar assistência. E aí a gente começa todo esse processo importantíssimo. O governo do estado, por exemplo, está fazendo a captação de investimentos junto ao BNDES, porque nenhuma política do estado agora, do Pará, e eu queria cumprimentar o meu amigo, leve um abraço para o Ionilson, presidente do Instituto de Terra de Roraima, que está levando o CICARF para lá, né? Para dizer o seguinte, qualquer ação, qualquer investimento que tem entrado no estado agora, ele vincula 3 agendas: fundiária, ambiental e produção. Ou seja, para botar recurso de fato, recurso com valores, custo baixo para esses produtores. Fora isso, tem outros projetos do governo federal tão importantes quanto, como o crédito fundiário, programa Terra da Gente, o que a gente está precisando, se assenhorar desses projetos e tomar a frente. Inclusive, presta aqui, fazer uma propaganda rapidamente, só todo esse trabalho que a gente está fazendo, e eu apresentei rapidamente para vocês, a gente vai estar lançando o livro do ITERPA amanhã. Tá? Esse livro conta justamente como foi esse processo todinho de estruturação estratégica da área do Estado. Então isso é muito importante e a gente conta com a presença daqueles que tiverem disponibilidade para estar lá amanhã de manhã, na Blue Zone, às 9 horas da manhã, para fazer o lançamento e a divulgação. Embora ele já esteja disponível em formato digital no site do ITERPA. Tá bom? Obrigado.
Thank you, Bruno. And I think there was one more question. Or 2 more questions.
Hello. Congratulations for the panel. I'm Felipe, I'm from Rio de Janeiro, and I work, okay, better? Yes, so I work in a project that uses community-led responses to land reforms in Rio's informal settlements, specifically the Community Land Trust. So I would like to ask you too, there are many types of land reform programs, right? All over the world. And in Brazil, in the past years, there's been developing a new model that focuses almost exclusively in individual titling for informal settlements. And even though new legislation facilitates process, bureaucracy and everything, it leads to another challenge, which is how do we deal with gentrification and market-oriented displacements in informal settlements after the land reform programs. So I'd like to understand how you see this globally and how are you addressing the dangers of a specific and unique model for land reform all over the world. E para o Bruno, queria parabenizar pelo programa, os resultados são impressionantes. Você fala em 43 mil títulos, eu queria entender quais são esses títulos, como você vem envolvendo os cartórios nesse projeto, e você focou muito na dimensão rural, eu queria saber se o urbano também está presente, de que forma vocês estão lidando com isso. Obrigado.
Hello, my name is Romy. I work for the Land Portal Foundation. So I have a question for you, Bruno. And the question is about, it's first of all also very impressive the work you have been doing. And the question is about how open and accessible the information that you fed into the CCOF is to society. Because we know that doing regulating land is not easy. There are a lot of contestations. So is it possible for society to have access also to this data to verify it by themselves? Thank you.
Thank you. And okay, we've run out of time, so this may be the last round of questions, but I'll ask you to give a brief response. Then to the person who asked the first question, there's our colleague called Malcolm Childress who works with the Global Alliance for Territorial Communities. We'll connect you with him, and I think he can give an even longer response to your question. Okay, so I think, Beth, a brief one, then we move to Bruno.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think what you're speaking to at the core is the need for deep communication with the communities who live on the land. You know, I think we tend to understand land as being, it's there, but our relationship to it is never static. Tenure is never static. People in informal settlements have often come from rural areas, and then even, as you're saying, when it's regularized, there can be a threat of market speculation or market forces that drive people out of the land. So the question I didn't answer earlier from Washa was work on responsible investments. There are many different layers at which this needs to be addressed. It can be addressed at the state or the municipal level by a commitment to be in dialogue with people in informal settlements. It can be addressed by not adhering to the assumption of individualized title, but really working with people in informal settlements or anywhere where land is being recognized to articulate what are the needs of that community and to recognize title in a way that meets those needs. And it can be recognized in terms of responsible investments from sort of a more top-down perspective. So if a company is operating in a municipality, are they required to adhere to anything related to free and prior and informed consent? Are they following responsible investment practices? So that's part of, Landesa does some of that work from a corporate engagement perspective. There's a whole world there that we don't have time to unpack, but just wanted to note, I think that's a really key question and needs to be addressed from multiple levels and in multiple ways.
Thank you, Beth. And Bruno, please.
Bem, obrigado pela pergunta. 43.444, eles estão divididos em... Aí eu acho que já vou até te responder a segunda pergunta. Estão divididos em 65% em áreas rurais, 65% e os 35% em áreas urbanas. Por quê? O Estado também tem áreas públicas urbanas, nos núcleos urbanos. Então, nós alteramos a legislação porque não havia previsão legal. A maioria dos estados não tem essa previsão legal e nós entendíamos que havia necessidade de estender essa política pública para as áreas municipais, as áreas urbanas. Então, nós criamos, dentro do CICAF, você tem dois módulos. O módulo que é rural, para atender as áreas rurais, e o módulo urbano, que é para atender REURB. e toda a nossa parametrização está de acordo com a norma, com a lei da REURB. Tá? Então, é esse cenário que a gente tem. Fizeste mais uma pergunta. Ah, sim, cartório. Realmente é um grande desafio do Brasil. A gente vê boa vontade da Noreg, boa vontade do CNJ. Por conta disso, nós temos um grupo de trabalho para fazer o quê? Através do CICARF, esse documento já entra eletronicamente no cartório. É muito interessante vocês conhecerem esse trabalho, apoiarem esse trabalho, porque a gente faz a regularização aí sim, de ponta a ponta. Por isso que é fundamental para a gente termos esses intercâmbios, essas conversas, virem conhecer o trabalho do ITERPA, a gente está de portas abertas para poder estar mostrando, está aprendendo coisas novas também, está absorvendo coisas novas, está ensinando, ou seja, é um grande compartilhamento. Então, eu já estendo aqui o convite a todos vocês para estarem conhecendo o nosso trabalho, né, para tornar esse assunto, como ele é mundial, que a gente já entendeu, criar esse intercâmbio entre todos nós de construção de soluções e não apenas de constatações de problemas. Com relação à sua pergunta, para finalizar aqui, há duas situações. Uma primeira que eu chamo de educação fundiária. As pessoas têm que aprender sobre regularização fundiária. Elas têm que passar a entender sobre regularização fundiária e não ficar apenas naqueles assuntos problemáticos. Problema a gente já sabe. Agora, qual é a nossa capacidade de resolver esse problema? E é um processo que eu chamo de educação fundiária. A gente tem que se educar para isso. Esse é o primeiro ponto. Segundo, compartilhamento de informações. O ITERPA vai ajudou o projeto do Sistema Nacional de Governança Fundiária do Brasil. É uma grande plataforma e o ITERPA vai ser o primeiro estado que vai conectar com o governo federal na criação dessa plataforma nacional. E aí vai ter mais acessibilidade, mais acesso para justamente ter as pesquisas, os acompanhamentos e a total transparência. E um outro ponto importante, nós constantemente estamos fazendo cursos online sobre o CICARF, como é que ele funciona. A gente está investindo muito nessa parte de divulgação desse trabalho.
Thank you, Bruno, for the detailed response, and also thank you to the audience for engaging with our panelists, because I think I'm getting even up. We need more time to have this discussion. I feel like we've run out of time, but nonetheless, thank you to the panelists. We have 5 minutes left, and at some point I have to hand over back to Jolene, but I want to give some brief remarks just to try and tie around the conversation that we've had so far. So, Global Action for Land, or GAL, which I'm representing today, is trying to push for the integration, a more specific integration of land governance within the UNFCCC framework. And from the discussion we've had so far, we see that there are many different aspects of land governance that could fit in that integration. So, for example, we've had on women's land rights, we've had on smallholder farmings, we've had indigenous and territorial community land rights. All these issues would fall under one umbrella called land governance. And so far, I mean, within the convention, there's progress, but there's also challenges. On the progressive side, there's continuous mention of IPLC rights, women's land rights, and so on. But these issues are growing at the periphery. In terms of the text of the convention, we are not seeing that increase, but rather we are seeing some decrease. And that's why we are working towards pushing for more specific integration that would give global guidance on how to integrate land into climate policies at the national level. And this global guidance is best implemented if it's led by the governments. The governments have to be part of the change. And that's why I have repeatedly encouraged the Brazilian government, and I would say it again, I think it's good that Brazil and also a number of other countries are leading the charge when it comes to introducing this land governance topic within the environmental space. I'll also, before I finish, I want to mention something Bruno mentioned in one of his responses. I don't know if this was deliberate, but I think he said the Brazilian government, there are 3 agendas when it comes to development, and he said land tenure, environment, and production. And I know in our circles we talk about people and planet, so I don't know if this was deliberate, but it's nice that we start with the land tenure, which to me represents the people, then environment, which is planet, and production, which is last, so profit comes last after people and planet, which I would say is probably the best kind of arrangement of these 3 issues that we should be addressing. Now, with that, with the few minutes you're left, I'd like to first thank my panelists for the detailed contributions. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you, Alan. And thank you, Beth, for the very detailed contributions. Thank you to the audience for joining us and for bearing with the enthusiasm that is in this green zone. Bearing with the enthusiasm, let me call it that. I'd also like to share my thank yous to the land facility, of course, for offering this opportunity for both GAL and other land sector actors to contribute to this discussion. And before I hand over to Jolene, I'll mention that the land facility has a booth right outside this pavilion. You turn left, then right towards the end, there's a land facility booth. We have more information about this topic, and we will also be there in person in case you want to continue with these discussions. And that I can now hand over to Jolene, please, to close. Thank you, Jolene.
Also, my thank yous. So also, I just wanted to say thank you, but mostly I wanted to point out to those who speak Portuguese at the QR code on the handout that you have. Hay una versión de este documento en portugués. Y also for all the rest of the audience, at that same QR code, there are a number of documents that speak to some of the questions. So, for example, our colleagues at Landesa have released guidance on how to incorporate this issue area into the nationally determined contributions, and you can find that there. We have guidance also around why private sector should put their support behind this rather than blocking those kinds of things. And we'd love to continue this conversation. We really want to put all the efforts together on the political commitment level, on the legal issues, on the social norms issues that Beth talked about, on the technologies, into the formal COP UNFCCC frameworks, hopefully in another couple of years from now, because as all the speakers have said and Washe just said, it's so fundamental. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you once again to the audience. I think with that, we can end this panel here. And we have 30 seconds to go, so we are right on time.